You consider yourself a good person. You help your neighbors, you follow the law, and you would never dream of hurting someone without a reason. But the real answer is far stranger than you think. Deep inside your brain lies an ancient survival mechanism that can turn even the kindest human into a monster given the right conditions. You are not as safe from your own shadow as you believe. Imagine sitting in a pristine university laboratory. A man in a crisp white lab coat steps forward and hands you a set of control dials. On the other side of a glass partition sits an ordinary person wrapped in wires. The man in the lab coat tells you to ask the person questions. Every time they answer incorrectly, you must flip a switch. Each flip delivers a higher voltage of electrical shock. At first, the voltage is mild. But quickly, the numbers climb. 45 volts, 150 volts, 300 volts. The person behind the glass screams in agony. They beg you to stop. They clutch their chest and complain of heart pain. You look back at the researcher in the lab coat, visibly shaken, and ask if you should continue. The researcher simply says in a calm, firm voice, "The experiment requires that you continue." What do? If you are like most people, you assume you would refuse. You assume you would stand up, throw down the wires, and walk out of the room. But when social psychologist Stanley Milgram actually conducted this study at Yale University in 1961, the results shocked the world. Before the experiment, Milgram surveyed 40 psychiatrists, asking them to predict how many participants would administer the maximum, potentially lethal 450-volt shock. The experts predicted that less than 1% of participants would go all the way. They believed only true psychopaths would inflict that kind of pain. They were dead wrong. A staggering 65% of ordinary, everyday people flipped every single switch, right up to the maximum 450 volts, long after the person behind the glass had gone completely silent. These were not criminals, sadists, or sociopaths. They were accountants, teachers, mechanics, and salesmen. They sweated, they stammered, they trembled with anxiety, but they kept pushing the buttons simply because an authority figure told them to. Why does your brain yield to authority so easily? The answer takes us back hundreds of thousands of years to the African savanna. For early humans, solitary living meant guaranteed death. A lone hominid could not hunt large game, defend against apex predators, or keep warm during brutal nights. Survival required living in tight-knit groups. But group survival demands structure, and structure requires hierarchy. To maintain cohesion, early human groups developed a strong evolutionary trait: deferential obedience. Following the leader's directives kept the group organized during panic and crisis. Over generations, brains that automatically yielded to recognized authority survived and reproduced far more effectively than those that resisted. Your inclination to obey is not a moral failing. It is a deeply ingrained evolutionary shortcut. In 1971, another researcher named Philip Zimbardo decided to push this concept even further with the famous Stanford prison experiment. He transformed the basement of the Stanford Psychology building into a mock prison and recruited 24 healthy, psychologically stable male college students. Half were randomly assigned to be prisoners, while the other half were assigned to be guards. None of them had a history of violence or mental illness. What happened next horrified the researchers. Within just 24 hours, the guards began adopting harsh, cruel, and sadistic behaviors. They forced prisoners to strip naked, sleep on bare concrete, and carry out degrading tasks. The prisoners rapidly broke down, exhibiting severe emotional trauma and depression. The study was scheduled to run for 2 full weeks, but Zimbardo had to shut it down after just 6 days because the situation had dissolved into absolute psychological nightmare. The Stanford prison experiment highlighted a phenomenon known as deindividuation. When you enter a structured environment, adopt a uniform, or hide within a massive crowd, your sense of personal identity fades away. You stop evaluating your actions based on your internal moral compass. Instead, you adopt the norms and expectations of the role or group. In the human brain, this shift alters activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for moral decision-making, self-reflection, and social evaluation. When you feel anonymous or bound by a role, the prefrontal cortex dials down its vigilance. You no longer ask, "Is this right?" Instead, you ask, "Is this expected of me?" This psychological mechanism is amplified by another dark cognitive process, dehumanization. Neuroscientists like Dr. Losana Harris have studied how the human brain responds when viewing different social groups using functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. When you look at pictures of ordinary people, your brain lights up in the medial prefrontal cortex, the region dedicated to empathy and recognizing another human's thoughts and feelings. However, when participants were shown images of heavily marginalized groups, extreme outgroups, or enemy factions, that neural activity plummeted. The brain effectively stopped processing these individuals as human beings, viewing them instead as obstacles, objects, or threats. When propaganda or group ideology labels an opposing group as dangerous or subhuman, your brain's natural empathy switch flips completely off. Cruelty suddenly feels not only acceptable, but morally necessary for defense. Consider how easy it is to fall into this trap today. You scroll through social media and see a group of people with opposing political views, different cultural norms, or contrasting belief systems. Your brain naturally categorizes them as the outgroup. You might mock them, cheer for their public humiliation, or dismiss their suffering. You aren't doing this because you are an inherently evil person. You are doing it because your ancient neural circuitry is doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect the in-group by delegitimizing the out-group. The frightening truth is that evil is rarely performed by people who believe they are evil. History reveals that the most atrocious acts were carried out by ordinary people who believed they were doing their duty, protecting their families, or following legitimate orders. They were husbands who kissed their children goodnight after spending the day enforcing unspeakable cruelty. They were citizens who stood by in silence as their neighbors were dragged away, reassuring themselves that authority knew best. So, how do you prevent your own brain from taking this path? It begins with radical self-awareness. You must realize that you are susceptible to the exact same evolutionary pressures that influenced the participants in Milgram's lab or Zimbardo's basement. Courage is not the absence of fear or the possession of superior morality. Courage is the conscious decision to pause, step out of the crowd, and reframe the situation using your own independent judgment. Tonight, when you step back out into the world, you will face moments where group pressure, authority, or ideological division will tempt you to close your eyes and fall in line. You will feel the subtle pull to treat someone outside your circle as less than human. But the real test of humanity is recognizing that shadow inside yourself before it takes control. Because in the end, the line separating good and evil does not run between nations, political parties, or groups. It runs straight through the center of every human heart.